Take a look at this photograph. What do you notice? This is Margaret Herrick. She was once the executive director of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Her contributions to film history and its preservation are unprecedented. But how did she get in this room in the first place? And what does this teach us about our recorded history as we know it today? In order to understand this, we first need to know when we are. These images were captured on 16mm film by a camera operator, risking their life. In that time, people like you and I would have watched footage just like this in a documentary or a newsreel. But in a movie theater. This was a cross-section for film and its purpose in society. The role of film to preserve time was becoming further cognizant of itself. Hollywood was partnering with the military to publish propaganda, celebrities were selling war bonds.
Jimmy has now won promotion. Today, he's Lieutenant Stewart, USA.
Filmmakers were trying to convey the range of affections felt from the war. The battlefield, the home front, the love, the loss, and of course, the cry for a distraction from it all. At this moment, and in the middle of this paradigm shift in history, Margaret was just beginning her own shift. Her first husband was Donald Gledhill, the executive secretary at the Academy of Motion Pictures, and he was about to leave for the war. You see, Margaret was a librarian. She and Donald came to Los Angeles in the early 30s, and she began working at the Academy's library in an unofficial capacity. The library wasn't much at the time, and it was void of proper administrators. Margaret got to work. She and a colleague wrote the classification scheme for motion picture collections, which was an extension of the Dewey Decimal System specialized just for cinema collections. As a librarian, she understood that cataloging and organizing history parallels its accessibility and preserves its use for the future. Her trust with the board of directors grew, and when Doug left for the war, they lifted her into an interim position to replace her husband. Now, I know this scenario sounds like something you may have heard of in history books. It's really not. Well, it is, but not in this context. So there's this sort of myth that at this time women were getting out of the kitchen and into the factories, when in fact most of the women upholding America's industries were already working, and mostly took jobs producing war supplies because they paid more. But even then, they were still getting paid less than their male counterparts. And a majority of these workers were black women and women of color, not the perceived white working class figure in this famed poster. Margaret's rise says a lot more about our sensationalized patriarchal systems. When she was promoted, it did not go unnoticed. It was on the cover of Variety magazine, and just look at this headline. It doesn't even have her name. It all reads familiar, like they're just propping Margaret up and saying, hey, look how diverse we're being. And even more specifically, it says a lot more about Hollywood's singular pipeline of white nepotism, which is just the industry's modern practice of white supremacy. Margaret's road was undoubtedly engulfed with sexism, but it was still paved with structural whiteness. She can easily be rendered as a hero that overcame the odds and became an example of feminist perseverance. Or her success is a mirage, simply a mere notion of progress. Or she's just the beneficiary of a system built to privilege white people. These are all symptoms of larger systemic issues. That can't be overlooked. But they also morph her into a symbol, whittling her humanity down to simply her representation, instead of the work she accomplished. In that way, she's a lot more like this image. Rosie the Riveter, the icon, the poster, was largely unknown when it was produced in 1943. It wasn't a call to action or even deliberate US propaganda. It was just a commissioned poster by a Westinghouse Electrical Plant's Labor Committee, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Those workers were the only ones who saw it. Remember, this was all post-New Deal, so it was created as part of a series of posters to increase production and avoid strikes, all in the attempt to discourage workers from unionizing. I'm giving this background because this image, which was largely unknown until the 1980s, has grown to become one of the most powerful and inspiring symbols of feminism and workers' rights across the entire world. It's such a great example of how if something is captured in history and preserved, then it can go on to develop its own emotional history for the future. And in the mid-40s, when everyone was looking towards an uncertain future for themselves, Margaret was busy looking into the past.
Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished.
By the time Donald returned from the war in 1945, Margaret had redefined the position she was working. The Academy offered her the job full-time. She and Donald would divorce. Margaret remarried a year later, and for the rest of her professional career was known as Margaret Herrick.
Mission accomplished.
It's 1947. As the executive director, she facilitated the donation of the William Seelig papers. This is where things really start to matter, because Seelig was a significant figure. He founded one of the first motion picture companies in America. The guy rivaled Thomas Edison. His collections spanned decades and included everything from posters to industry patents. This was a massive haul for the library, not just in quantity but clout as well. This move basically said to the entire industry that the Academy was the primary research for film, and it set the standard going forward. So just in case you're not aware, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, it's
We'd like to thank the Academy.
I'd like to thank the Academy for naming me.
I'd like to thank the Academy.
I'd like to thank the Academy for this.
I'd like to thank the Academy.
I'd like to thank the Academy.
Well, it's my privilege. Thank you.
that Academy. Margaret actually helped negotiate the first television contract for the Academy Awards. Even today, the telecast actually generates funding in the name of research, development, and preservation.
We saw your boobs. In the movie that we saw your boobs. Kristen Stewart, we saw your boobs in On the Road, and in Monster, we saw Charlize Theron.
Yeah. By the 60s, Margaret was a prominent figure, and she became one of the film industry's greatest ambassadors around the globe. There was a growing international interest in the Foreign Language Film Award, and the Oscars were eager to expand their reach. But from Margaret's perspective, you could see the value in this. Film media doesn't just belong to Hollywood, it has always had a global history. Her presence at various universities, film festivals, studios, and film academies sent a message that went beyond a trophy. It says, everyone that makes a film, no matter where you are, makes history. Much like how the Seelig Papers established the importance of the Academy's collection to Hollywood preservation, this established their work to the whole world of cinema. And clearly this was not done in vain, especially when you consider 2020 brought us the first non-English speaking film to win Best Picture in Parasite. Maybe that seems like it took too long, and yeah, it was, but the groundwork was laid down. It's the people who make decisions and have power that chose not to use it until now. When Margaret retired in 1971, the Academy renamed the library after her. I'll say this again in case you missed that. Margaret retired, and they changed the name of the place she worked after her. Today, the Margaret Herrick Library stands in its own location in Beverly Hills, California, serving academics, researchers, students, and anyone that wants to learn from over 1,000 collections of motion picture materials that are available. The library is open to the entire public and fully accessible. Well, as accessible as you think Beverly Hills, California is. Now, there's one more notable aspect of Margaret Herrick's career that I have saved to the end. That's because it's probably the thing that she is most famous for. If you Google her name, you'll hear about the library, sure. But there's a bit of pop cultural trivia that shows up as well. She's often credited with giving the Academy Awards golden statue its nickname, Oscar. So the story goes like this. Around 1935, when Margaret was still just the Academy's librarian, she saw the statue for the first time and said that it reminded her of her uncle Oscar. Here's the thing, she's not the only person to claim they named the statue. I know, shocker. Sidney Skolsky, an LA writer and kinda early gossip columnist, was the first to publish the nickname in print, which is a compelling argument to be given the credit. But he says he named it after Oscar Hammerstein Sr. as a reference to his name being the butt of an old vaudeville joke, where the punchline was always, "Will you have a cigar, Oscar?" It's very vague. The interesting fact about that, though, is Oscar Hammerstein's grandson, Oscar Hammerstein II, actually won an Academy Award, and he's the only person in history named Oscar to win an Oscar. And then there's Betty Davis, who claims she came up with the name because the statue's butt reminded her of her husband, Harmon Oscar Nelson Jr. I don't know. That's his middle name. I don't even know why she would say that. This is okay. I I need to just break the fourth wall for a second. Finally. The origin story of the statue's butt. This is what it's come to. Margaret Herrick's legacy really comes down to a question here. Some people might not see the significance of her work, because if you have the films and you have the context in which they were made, what more do you need to pass on this information? The story that is told through Margaret's work lies here. By saving original posters and concept art with the names of the artists, patents of the equipment used, with the names of the engineers, or old call sheets with information like the names of the caterers that brought food to the crew that day. It tells a story of all of the work that went into making all of this happen. Most of us spend most of our time working. It's relatable. So it's fair to say that the work we all put in is the history that is made. We just don't all get our names at the end of the credits. Most of history is about filling in the blanks. And Margaret spent her whole life giving us the material to help fill it in. So when it comes to the claims about naming the Oscar, the fact that she is caught up in what feels like a Hollywood battle of commendation and acclaim, it's contrary to everything she did in her career. It's folklore, but also she deserves it. She deserved an Oscar. Unfortunately, the end of this project doesn't end with a revelatory new fact that proves otherwise. That's just it. We just have to live with the hearsay. So the question is this: does Margaret's legacy lie within the walls of a building with her name on it? Or is it defined by sensationalized speculation? And you know, I actually might have an answer for you. Well, it does, but also it really doesn't. Remember what I said about the Rosie the Riveter poster? How sometimes history creates a meaning for something that exceeds its true origin. What doesn't matter as much about Margaret is whether she came up with a nickname. What matters is that at some point in your life, you may have asked yourself, why do they call it the Oscars? And if you look it up, you'll find a story that you didn't know. You'll uncover some of the labor behind the groundwork required for passing information on to the next generation. You'll learn about someone whose work will last into antiquity. You'll discover the story of a librarian who dedicated her life, her time, her work to preserving history, and how she changed it.